The ink was already dry on the $2 million wire transfer. Victor had quietly liquidated the family estate while his sister, Elena, was out of the country. No probate, no warning, and no paper trail to follow. He thought the cash was safe in a blind trust. But the title company had just received a certified overnight envelope. Inside was a missing deed restriction that froze the entire sale, and a signature proving their father, Thomas, knew exactly what he was planning. Elena was 6,000 miles away on a work contract when she got the call. Thomas had suffered a sudden and massive stroke. By the time her international flight landed, the funeral arrangements were already finished. Victor met her at the airport terminal. He played the role of the grieving, responsible older brother flawlessly. Sitting in the terminal coffee shop, he told her Thomas had died completely broke. He claimed the private hospice care had eaten through the remaining family savings. When Elena asked about the $2 million house they grew up in, Victor just shook his head. He pulled a stack of redacted bank statements from his briefcase and slid them across the table. He told her the bank had initiated a quiet foreclosure months ago. She was exhausted, grieving, and isolated from the local court system. She looked at the dense financial paperwork and believed him. But there was no foreclosure. Victor had planned this financial execution for nearly a year. While Thomas was struggling with early cognitive decline, Victor had brought a private traveling notary to the house. He had his father sign a massive stack of routine medical directives. Buried in the middle of that stack was a quitclaim deed. With one stroke of a pen, the property was transferred into a formed anonymous holding company. Victor was the sole managing director of that shell corporation. Because the house was no longer in Thomas's name, it bypassed the county probate courts entirely. When Thomas died, his official estate didn't just fade, it vanished like it was never there. Elena had no legal standing to request a judicial audit of a corporate asset. With his sister locked out of the system, Victor moved to liquidate. He bypassed traditional real estate agents and went straight to an off-market commercial broker. He offered a 20% discount for an immediate all-cash buyer who wouldn't ask any questions. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was lying. She spent an entire week calling the local probate court from her temporary apartment. She asked the clerks to pull the foreclosure filings for her father's address. The clerks searched the county database and found nothing. Because the house was held in Victor's anonymous LLC, there was no public probate record attached to Thomas's name. Desperate, she called Victor directly. "Just let me see the original foreclosure notice," she asked. He laughed. "You wouldn't understand the paperwork," he said. Then he hung up. That was the moment she knew. She hired a low-cost private investigator to pull the property tax records. The investigator hit the exact same corporate firewall. The tax bills were being routed to a registered agent at a strip mall post office box. Every legal avenue Elena pursued ended at a corporate veil, impenetrable and unbroken. She was out of money and entirely out of options. She started packing her suitcases, accepting that her family history was gone forever. Meanwhile, the closing took place on a Tuesday morning in a high-rise conference room. Victor sat across from the commercial broker, checking his expensive watch. He didn't care about the history of the property or the childhood memories inside it. He only cared about the wire transfer confirmation. The title officer stamped the final corporate resolution. The buyer signed the closing disclosure. With a few keystrokes, $2 million was routed into Victor's offshore trust account. He walked out of the glass building feeling completely untouchable. He bought a first-class ticket to Geneva for the following week. He assumed his sister would never be smart enough to look past the fake foreclosure papers. Elena was taping up her final moving box when the postal carrier knocked on her door. He handed her a thick, rigid envelope sealed with red security tape. The return address belonged to a retired estate attorney Thomas had used 20 years ago. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a single notarized document dated 2 weeks before Victor's quitclaim deed. It was an irrevocable deed restriction. Thomas had sensed his son's manipulation during his early cognitive decline. He couldn't stop the daily pressure from Victor, so he built a silent failsafe. The restriction explicitly forbade the sale of the property without Elena's physical, notarized consent. And it carried a self-executing fraud penalty. If anyone attempted to transfer the title using a corporate shell, the property instantly reverted to a designated family trust, a trust controlled entirely by Elena. Victor was packing his suitcase when his phone rang. It was the commercial broker, and he was panicking. The county recorder's office had just rejected the deed transfer. The retired attorney hadn't just mailed a copy of the restriction to Elena. He had filed the original document into the county archives using an obscure legacy system. It lay dormant like a landmine until the title company tried to record the new commercial sale. The escrow software flagged the transaction as a catastrophic title failure. The title insurance company reversed the wire transfer to protect themselves from massive liability. Victor desperately checked his offshore banking app. The $2 million balance had vanished. His flawless corporate ghost had just been dragged into the light. The fallout was swift and brutal. Because Victor had used the postal service and digital wire systems to execute a fraudulent transfer, it became a federal issue. Postal inspectors and financial crimes task forces dismantled his holding company in 48 hours. They court-ordered the traveling notary's physical logbook and found massive irregularities. The notary confessed that Victor had covered the deed with medical paperwork when Thomas signed it. The commercial buyer then sued Victor for breach of contract and extensive legal fees. His own defense attorneys demanded a massive upfront retainer he could no longer afford. Facing decades in prison for wire fraud and elder abuse, Victor surrendered his passport. He pled down to a lesser felony, but the financial ruin was permanent. The court dissolved his shell corporation and seized his remaining personal assets for restitution. Elena walked into the family home 3 months later, the rightful owner of the estate. But the victory couldn't erase the betrayal she felt standing in the quiet hallway. Her own brother had tried to erase her from their father's legacy. The house was secure, but the family was destroyed forever. A physical robbery leaves a broken window and obvious destruction. A corporate execution happens in total silence across a mahogany table. Predators like Victor rely on grief and exhaustion to mask their paperwork. They hide behind holding companies and weaponize the complexity of the law. If Thomas hadn't recognized the threat and planted that legal landmine, the money would be in Geneva right now. How many inheritances are being stolen today because no one is looking at the metadata? The most sophisticated thieves don't wear masks. They wear tailored suits and carry a notary stamp.